Christmas Eve, 1969. The North Sea was howling, winds so violent they nearly tore apart a lonely offshore drilling rig. Everyone thought it was a losing bet, a reckless gamble. Until black gold came bursting out of the seabed. For the first time, oil had been found in these waters, and just like that, Norway, a poor Nordic country living off salted fish and timber, realized it was sitting on God's own piggy bank. In financial history, this is usually where the murder begins. Economists call it Dutch disease. Others know it as the resource curse. It's like a cursed inheritance. Countries that receive it either fall into war or spend decades drowning in inflation, watching their industries rot, and eventually die from greed. So what about Norway? Not only did Norway become one of the world's most developed countries in just a few decades, the real surprise is this. It now owns the largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet, $1.9 trillion in assets, holding roughly 1.5% of the total market value of all publicly listed companies worldwide. And every dollar of it traces back to oil money. So what really happened here? Was it chaos, euphoria, corruption, or a crime no one noticed? The story doesn't begin with money, it begins with fear. In the 1970s, oil revenue hit Norway like a tidal wave. Prices surged. Everyone wanted a piece of the oil rush. And like every oil-producing nation, once an economy ties itself to oil, it starts rising and falling with oil prices. The first oil crisis in 1973 forced the Norwegian government to face a hard truth. Oil is temporary wealth. It's like winning the lottery. Do you blow it all? Or do you plan for the long run? Once the question was on the table, there was only one problem left. Who do you trust to answer it? That's when Farouk Al-Qasim enters the story. Born in Iraq, a petroleum geologist working for the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate, an outsider, which meant he smelled the rot before anyone else did. He was the one who helped Norway design its early oil tax system and the rules for managing petroleum resources. And his message was blunt. The oil doesn't belong to this generation. It belongs to the future. Spend it all now and you're robbing your own children. So once the goal was clear, the real question became, what do you do with oil? And more money than you can possibly spend. In 1983, a man named Hermod Skånland, former central bank governor, led something called the Tempo Committee. Its conclusion was cold, calm, and dangerous in its simplicity. Don't spend the oil money. Save it, invest it globally, and only spend the real returns. 7 years later, in 1990, that idea became law, the Government Petroleum Fund Act. That's when Norway's government pension fund Global was born, GPFG. But don't call it just a fund. This was a dam, a massive one. It stopped the flood of oil dollars before they could tear the Norwegian economy apart. Then it redirected that flow out into the world. The rules were strict. Each year, the government could withdraw no more than 4% of the fund's total value and inject it into the national budget. Why 4%? Because at the time, that was the estimated long-term real return of the fund. Meaning one thing, the government would live off the interest and never touch the principal. Think of it like this. You own a goose that lays golden eggs. Most countries kill the goose, or sell it, or trade it for a few nights of cheap wine. Norway made a different call. The goose stays alive, the goose is never touched, and they don't even eat the eggs right away. They take the eggs, hatch them, raise new geese, and only then use the eggs. Those geese lay to improve their lives. That rule has a name, the bird-in-the-hand rule. Instead of wasting oil wealth, Norway turned it into financial assets it could actually control. Oil runs out. That's inevitable. But investment returns, those compound, quietly, relentlessly. At this point in the investigation, I have to raise the question that worries me the most. In financial markets, the greatest enemy of investing isn't a financial crisis. It's not black swan events. It's human greed and whether you can resist it. We've seen this story play out countless times. For an individual, the damage from bad investing is limited. At worst, one person, or one family, loses everything. But for a nation, when an entire country's oil income is concentrated into a single pool of capital, how do you make sure the returns actually last? And more importantly, how do you stop the whole country from losing everything in one fatal mistake? Having a vault doesn't mean you're safe. Once the money starts moving, once a single decision can redirect hundreds of millions of dollars, what you eliminate becomes more important than what you choose. First, they eliminated gambling. GPFG locked itself into strict asset allocation, 60 to 70% in stocks, the rest in bonds and real estate. Even at the height of the dot-com madness, they stuck to the rules. No excitement, no emotion, like a machine quietly buying shares in more than 9,000 companies. Second, and this is where it gets interesting, they went beyond finance. They created an ethics council. Every investment was reviewed. Money was blocked from flowing into companies they deemed unacceptable. Tobacco, weapons of mass destruction, child labor. Norway used morality as a risk filter. They pulled out of Walmart over labor rights. They divested from Boeing and Lockheed Martin over landmines and cluster bombs, not because it felt good, but because it reduced long-term risk. And finally, they eliminated panic. 2008, the global financial tsunami, everyone was selling, cash was king. What was GPFG doing? They were buying. While the world was dumping assets at fire sale prices, Norway showed up with oil cash and went shopping, even as losses piled up on paper, because they understood something others didn't. The bird-in-the-hand rule gave them a privilege. They never had to sell umbrellas in the middle of a storm. They owned an entire room full of them. Faf, by now, I think we have our answer. Norway didn't survive the resource curse and end up sitting on $1.9 trillion because they were smarter than everyone else, or because God played favorites. The truth is darker and harder. It was restraint, deliberate, disciplined, deeply unnatural restraint. That money was never meant for the present. Every generation of Norwegians is just a temporary custodian, a night watchman guarding someone else's vault. So they built a system, layers of laws, checks and balances, radical transparency, all for one purpose: to lock themselves inside a cage, to stop a moment of political impulse, or one generation's appetite for pleasure from burning through wealth that belongs to centuries. In a world addicted to instant gratification and debt-fueled consumption, Norway spent half a century running one of the most convincing experiments in long-term thinking humanity has ever seen. It tells us something uncomfortable about investing. Picking Tesla or Nvidia might be luck, timing the market might be luck, but restraint is always earned, and it's always worth respecting. Because real wealth isn't about how much oil you dig out of the ground. It's about how many temptations you chose to walk away from. If you gained a new perspective from the videos, please subscribe. The case has temporarily come to a close, but the truth about money is far from over, and I will continue to guide you in finding clues.